Give it a little tap. That shouldn't be like that. I'm guessing there's a synchro that's broken as well. There it is. What's up everyone? Today we're going to be doing a how-to swap the gear sets in your Miata transmission. We have this broken transmission right here, and we have a B2000 pickup truck gear set that we're going to be taking out of this transmission and putting it into that one. Earlier this year, I broke second gear in my transmission and I swapped in a B2000 Mazda pickup truck gear set into that bell housing, and it worked great. I finished out the season and it was perfectly fine for a transmission swap. Now, I got both of these transmissions for free from two different friends. The Miata transmission, second gear, I believe is completely destroyed, kind of like what happened to my transmission. This B2000 transmission was just sitting in a shed. I got both of them for free, so we're gonna put them together and make one free spare transmission for my Miata behind me. So the Miata transmission, unfortunately, is the weak point in a boosted Miata application. So therefore, you need to either do some sort of upgrade to a BMW ZF transmission, a Nissan like CDO1, CDO9, something like that. I believe there's even maybe a T56 swap kit for that. Not entirely sure, that's quite a big transmission for a Miata engine. Or you can do something kind of like what I'm doing and swapping in a pickup truck gear set into the Miata transmission. Now, the B2000, B2200 and the B2600 should all just transplant directly into the housing of the Miata. They should all measure the same length from the front of the input shaft to the back of the output shaft where the drive shaft goes into the back side of the transmission. However, you may come into certain applications or certain years that it maybe doesn't work with the NA transmission. I'm not real familiar with how the NB transmissions work, so you may be able to do that same thing in that application. I am not 100%. I just know the NAs. We're gonna jump right into the work here. I'm gonna try and explain the best I can. In the previous video, I kind of just sped through it just so I can get it done because I needed to have the car back up and running within, I think, a weekend for another event. So I'm going to kind of give you a breakdown of what we're gonna start with and the process throughout disassembly, and then taking apart the B2000 transmission should be pretty similar to the Mazda transmission, and then we're going to show you the reassembly process and the pieces you need to swap over from the Miata to the B2000 gear set. Now, the tools that you're gonna need is either a 3/8 drive 12mm socket with a ratchet. You could use a 12mm wrench. You'll need to have a long enough extension to reach through the power plant frame brace area, or you can potentially have a 1/2-inch drive like impact for some of the more wide open nuts and bolts around the outside of the shifter section in the back. You will also need a 12mm for the 5 or 6 bolts that hold the front cover on around the input shaft. Now I'm going to start off with the Mazda Miata transmission, not the B2000, because we need to make room for the B2000 gear set to go in place right here. So I already took the time to degrease the bell housing and the shifter section. The center section doesn't really matter. It's no good. It's broken. That's coming out. Don't mess with really cleaning that a lot. You're not going to keep it anyways. Now I'm going to take off these bolts around the shifter linkage section first. We can actually take this portion completely off. It's where your shifter linkage goes in and shifts and moves the forks and pushes the gears in place. That's gonna come off, and then we're gonna tip it over onto the other side and take the front cover off where the input shaft seals in the bell housing. Now that we have the bolts separated or loosened up around the shifter section, you can try and move it. Probably not going to move. You won't typically ever take these apart unless you're doing something like I'm doing. So the glue on here is pretty solid. We'll tip this down and actually hit this with a hammer on a couple of these spots that are pretty nice and like thick pieces. Casting can be kind of fragile especially when cold, and it's pretty cold out right now. So just be mindful of that. Don't just take like a 5-pound maul and hit this. Take a rubber mallet or something, or if you do have just a big hammer, tap it lightly to start and see if you can get something in there to pry it open. Don't scratch the surface where these two pieces come together. This needs to be able to seal properly and very good so that your transmission fluid doesn't leak all over the place. Now, this one actually came right apart, so I don't have to smack on it with a hammer. So what we're gonna do is actually maybe tip this back up just for ease of pulling it apart. Now you're gonna kind of have to finagle and twist and move this around because the shifter fork that comes in through here goes in place on 3 other forks that are in the back of the gear set. So kind of lift it up, kind of twist it. I can't remember exactly which way you have to go with it. Just like that. Now it would be beneficial if you have your shifter in the shifter portion. I don't have a shifter for this, and I might need that or something to be able to move this to get it in and out of these forks when I go to put this back on when it comes time to that. All right, before we get too much farther into going into the transmission, once you get to this point, be very, very careful. All of these edges in here are very, very sharp. They are machined, factory, just nice flat plane surface. So every corner that you come to in here, be very careful. You can cut yourself open with barely even touching them at all. Now, when you come to finding any like broken gears or anything, don't touch them. Just kind of keep your hands away from them. You can basically cut your fingers just looking at them. Before we flip this down and go and remove that front cover by the input shaft, we have to pop out some locking pins and get these shifter forks out of here because we need to put them onto the B2000 transmission. Trust me, you need to do this. Also, we need to take this transmission gear off of here. This actually is for your speedometer. If you don't switch this out, your speedometer will read incorrectly. I did not switch this out on the one that is currently in my Miata, and my speedometer is almost like 30 miles an hour off. If you want to be able to know how fast you're going, you need to take this out and put this onto the B2000 gear set. Taking this off, however, will require a snap ring tool. You can get these pretty cheap. I want to say I picked this up at Harbor Freight. You can go pressing in and you can flip it and it'll actually pull out. So depending on the snap ring, this tool works really well. It also has interchangeable ends for different size snap rings. So I need to be able to pull this out and split that ring open to take it off the input shaft there. And then we will slide this gear out. There is a second ring underneath that we will take out as well, just in case we do need that. However, there should be also snap rings on that shaft in the B2000. Now, I would recommend anytime you're doing anything with like a preloaded spring or a snap ring like this, wear some sort of eye protection. I already wear glasses, so there's something there protecting my eyes. Get yourself a pair of safety glasses. You never know if this is gonna fly off and hit you in the face. Now this should just slide right off. It does look like, however, that the broken gears came up and smacked this gear. We might be able to clean these up and make that work still. Otherwise, I do have the purple gear from my original Miata transmission that I could use instead of this one. Now, get yourself a rag, lay it over these holes right here, so when you try and pop these little pins out, your little pin doesn't just drop down into the gear set. You're gonna be taking this all apart anyways, so it's not that big of a deal if it does go in there, as long as you can find that little pin, because you need them to be able to put these forks back into the B2000. Now, I just have some 3/16 stainless rod that I kind of sharpened the end on. That's what I'm gonna use to kind of start pressing them out. And then I have just an Allen wrench that's about the same size as that pin to be able to tap it the rest of the way out. Now we're gonna go from this side because they're kind of already protruding out that direction. We're gonna start off with the biggest one on the back, give it a little tap, just to get that started. Then grab your Allen key. Just like that. It's just this little key. It's like a spring-loaded key that locks that little fork in place. Now that should just wiggle right off. And there's the first shifter fork. You have to remember the orientation of these as well, because the big one does have to be closest to the center of the gear set, then the second one, and then the shortest one. I believe this is 5th in reverse, 3rd and 4th, 1st and 2nd. Now we'll do that with the other two, get these two forks off, tip this down and keep on moving. Now we have these 6 bolts that seal off the bell housing to the gear set so that no oil and fluid comes this direction forward and it doesn't get all over on your clutch. That's not good. You don't want lubrication or oil on your clutch at all. Now these are just 12 millimeter again. Shouldn't be torqued down super heavy. It's I think only like 30 foot-pounds. It's not a lot. So we're just gonna zip these off real quick. Then we can just kind of pop that out. It should have a little shim in there. Don't lose that shim. I don't see it here, which maybe this transmission didn't require a shim. I had a shim on my transmission, which maybe is a little concerning to me. It's supposed to basically put a little bit of a layer around in between the two bearings here. Ooh, there is one shim there. Mine was a whole shim that went the whole way around. This one just has one singular shim for the top bearing up here. It just sits right in there. Don't lose this. I knew there was a shim. I just didn't see it right away. We'll get this all cleaned up too. It's all full of oil. The old oil that potentially could have some shrapnel from the broken gear. And then we're gonna clean off inside of here. It is pretty dirty and greasy, so we don't want any of that when we reassemble it. So the only thing that's holding the gear set into the bell housing right now is this large snap ring right inside of here. We're gonna take that out. We should be able to just tap on the input shaft, which it seems like there's quite a bit of movement in here. So maybe something is broken other than just a gear. And then we can just pop this out. The gear set should fall out away from the bell housing, and then it's broken into 3 pieces. And then we can get everything cleaned out inside of the bell housing on the other side and should be all set to go. Grab your snap ring tool, kind of push that open. If you can get a finger behind it, or if you need a screwdriver, you might need a screwdriver to kind of help get that off around that bearing. There's a groove in the bearing where it sits in, kind of like that. Work your way around, and there it is. Now, normally going forward, you wouldn't actually hit that input shaft with like a steel hammer, you'd use a rubber mallet. This one, however, we can just hit it with a regular hammer. We're not putting it back into the car. Something's broken in here. So we're just gonna hit it with a hard hammer real quick, and it should pop that free from the bell housing and make light, easy work of this. There was the second shim, I believe, unless that was a seal. Now we'll actually flip this up. And we should be able to just lift this right off. Kind of be careful putting your fingers down in here just in case it's sharp. Just lift that whole thing up, tip it, grab the front of that, and then you can set the gear set down. Now be careful of the bell housing as well, very sharp. Now I just set a couple rags on the ground. We'll tip this bell housing over, get those gears to come out. So yeah, that's pieces of gears. Same thing that happened to mine, second gear is destroyed. We'll set this off to the side, come back to it, and clean that out in just a minute. All right, we'll kind of take a quick look at the gear set in here. This is your second gear. All of, like half of the gears on, or half of the teeth on the top gear are broken, and then half of them on the bottom are broken. I got it shifted into neutral right now. So you hold the input shaft, the front of the transmission, and you should be able to turn the tail shaft. It should turn all the synchros inside freely. And there's actually some room in here, like wiggle. That shouldn't be like that. I'm guessing there's a synchro that's broken as well. So then now it kind of locked itself. Yeah, now it's kind of locked in position there. That shouldn't do that. There we go, it came back in there. Now when you turn the input shaft, it should turn all of your gears. But then you get to a certain point here and it was locking up, like there's something maybe binding inside, and that could be why the transmission blew. However, doing heavy clutch kicks with a lot of load on the car can also do that. That's what happened to mine. I did a really big clutch kick in a high angle situation and it just couldn't take it. And my gears on the bottom actually took all the teeth off. The top gear I think was still all intact if I remember correctly. I'd have to be able to go back and show you that clip. This should turn the bottom gear, but it can't because there is 0 teeth left on this bottom drive gear. Now when you look at everything else looks like it seems to be in okay condition. Obviously this transmission cannot be used anymore with whatever play is in the front of the input shaft here. That's not normal, shouldn't be like that. There is also up and down play or side to side play. Something inside here is really messed up. We're gonna throw this off to the side. We don't need this anymore. This is all steel. You can throw it into a scrap bin. It's not something you throw into like a recycling bin or a regular dumpster. Make sure you dispose of this properly. Now, I got the Miata bell housing all cleaned up, should be all ready to go. Cleaned off the gasket surface for that front cover on the inside front portion of the bell housing. Now I'm going to go ahead and disassemble the B2000 transmission. I'm not going to show breaking that apart because it is the identical process to the Miata transmission. They look almost identical. However, the rear shifter section is different than the Miata. The B2000 transmission bell housing does not match up to the backside of the engine. That is why we're switching the gear set into the Miata transmission. You do need to do that. Otherwise, the B2000 transmission can't just bolt right up to the back of your engine. The inside of the backside of the bell housing is nice and clean. Got that all scrubbed out. No more broken gears in there. I think should be all set. Now we can just get that taken apart and do the reassembly process into this bell housing. Now I've got the B2000 transmission taken apart. The gear set is pulled out. Input shaft, output shaft, everything as a unit is pulled out of that bell housing. That is now sitting in the back corner, so I can get rid of that. No longer need anything else from the broken gear set or the B2000 shell. We're gonna take a quick look at this transmission, make sure everything is good to go, make sure the synchros look good just from the exterior. The gears look good for right now. We are going to clean both mating surfaces and the bell housing surface and use red silicone or high temp silicone to seal this. There is not a gasket, you have to use silicone. So I'll show you that real quick and then we'll continue this process. Just looking at this right now, I already switched this purple gear from the cream gear, that's the B2000 gear. It actually runs backwards compared to the Miata. This one runs counterclockwise, that one runs clockwise. And then the Miata shifter should match this gear so that the speedometer is accurate. That snap ring is now in place. I also switched over the shift forks from the other one. The other ones are right here. The reverse and fifth gear actually has a button lockout. So while the transmission is moving, you cannot shift into reverse. That is now out of the gear set, and the Miata one without that button is in its place. So these forks are actually longer by about a half an inch. That is why you can't use the B2000 gear fork shifters in the now Miata transmission. Now kind of just looking here, I'll spin the tail shaft. Everything spins through as it should. Technically it's in neutral, so it's not actually spinning. The synchros and everything are spinning inside. Now when you spin the input shaft on the front side, everything should turn all at one time, and then the output shaft or the tail shaft doesn't spin when there's no load on it or anything. So yeah, everything looks good. Nothing concerning to me anyways. The synchros are all pretty clean and the gears are all clean as well. So we're gonna make sure this surface right here is nice and clean. There's no gasket material left over or oil. And same thing on this side. There's some oil kind of sitting here. Gonna make sure that's all clean. And then we're gonna put red silicone on there first so that can start to cure a little bit. And then we will clean this up while that is drying and then set this back on place here. When you go to put the gear set back into the bell housing, those bearings are the same size as the Miata gear set bearings, so you shouldn't have any issues getting that down into the bell housing. However, if you're starting to find yourself fighting them in, take it back out, make sure everything is clean, make sure there's not a burr inside of the bell housing or something that's catching the bearing. You don't want to fight the bearing going in. That can put some abnormal pressure on the bearings. Make sure that that bearing is not getting smushed, pushed at an angle or anything. It has to seat in there nice and tight and flat so that it can spin all nice and freely. Now, when you go to put silicone around this surface on the back side of the bell housing, you don't need to put a ton, just put enough so where there's like a light coating, kind of right in the middle, not so much on the inside or on the outside. Don't set the gear set down on here right away. Let it sit and cure for like 2 minutes. Otherwise, if you just drop it right on there, it's gonna squish all the silicone out. There's basically gonna be nothing in there actually gluing that piece together, and it's not gonna seal properly. So we're just gonna work this around, kind of dab it with our fingers so it's a nice even spread all the way around, and then we'll clean up the surface on the gear set and then drop that in here. Give you guys a close-up look of that. I've always been kind of a smear guy. I smear it around so that it's a nice even coat all the way around. It's not like super thick or anything, just a nice light layer. And then we're just gonna leave that sit for a minute. Now I've tried this a couple of different ways where you put the silicone on it and you drop a part right on right away. I only did that one time, and that one time the oil leaked. And then I haven't done it that way ever since. I've always just let it sit, cure for a little bit, then put your part on there, and it's never leaked. Now that I say it, it's probably gonna leak. Hopefully it doesn't, because I'm doing it this way and it's never failed me before in the past. It has been a few minutes now. I'll just set this up on my leg to kind of show you this next part. There's 2 pins right here where your shifter forks and everything slide right here. These 2 have to go into a hole down there. So that kind of guides you into place, as well as the top bearing and your bottom bearing should drop into the bell housing with ease. If you find yourself trying to fight it in, take it back out, double check that the bell housing isn't like gouged or something to where it's snagging and hanging up on the bearings. This should just drop in really nice and easy. There shouldn't be a fight to it. There's also dowel pins on your gear set that go into the holes where the dowel pin would be on the back side of this bell housing. Those should line up as well. So there's 3 different spots that this lines up and drops into place. Don't fight it. You shouldn't have to sit there and smack it with a hammer. It should just drop in. Now this mating surface is nice and clean and dry. The glue has been curing for a few minutes. We're gonna carefully set this down into position and kind of just slightly wiggle it, and it should drop right into place. If it doesn't, we'll pull it off and check stuff out. It is kind of awkward because it is a large piece. Don't put your fingers in between here because it's very sharp and you don't want to squish your fingers. I'm just trying to locate the shifter pins. It's easier said than done because you can't see down in there. Now it's just the bearings that we gotta get to drop in there. There it is. Now we're going to put some silicone on the back side of the gear set. Let that cure a little bit. While that's doing that, we will spray out the inside here. I didn't have enough brake cleaner to kind of clean the inside of this. Make sure it's all clean and free of debris. You don't want anything floating around in this gear set once everything is all bolted together. So we'll get this cleaned up. We'll also clean out the shifter cup. I don't have anything to cover this, I think. I might have one from the old transmission that I can throw in here just to cap it off, because you don't want anything dropping into your shifter cup either. That's a lot of different spring-loaded pieces in there to hold it in place and in gear. So yeah, we're gonna smear some silicone real quick, clean this out, and then we can drop it on here. When you put silicone on this backside, it's basically the same as the backside of the bell housing. Make sure you get some around the dowel pins in the gear set so that the shifter section can adhere to these dowel pins. That centers the whole back section together. And then make sure you get around each one of these bolt holes so that it seals up real nice on the back side. Same thing, get a nice little smear, and then we're gonna smear it with our finger, get it nice and even. Should be all set and ready to go. This should be getting a little tacky. It's not peeling off of my finger very much, so that's good. It means it's starting to cure and stay where it needs to be. Now, we need to get this little oil trough that's right here lined up in one of these two holes. I can't remember exactly. I believe it's this one, because the dowel pin goes right here. We also have to get this shifter fork right here lined up inside of these three forks, which is kind of tricky. You have to line up that oil trough and twist it into position. Now go slow, take your time with this. If you feel like you're getting a little frustrated because it's not lining up, just pull it back off, take a second, retry it again. And set this on, just be careful when you're setting it down not to have your fingers in between sharp places, kind of like that. Grab up on the top and slowly slide that down into position. You're gonna have to go kind of like a 1 o'clock position to get that trough into that little hole. And then before you twist it into position or like fully in, it might actually be pretty close the first attempt, maybe. You can't see in there, that's the thing. No, I need the shifter pushed down into like third position or third gear. If only you could see down in there. That's what makes it tricky. Attempt number 2. This is very tricky. This is probably the most tricky and difficult part of the entire job, is getting this section back on here to line up with the shifter forks. Because you can't see any of it, and you can't, if you don't have a shifter in it, you can't really move it. We're gonna try a 3/8 drive extension for my shifter. It'd be really nice if I would have gotten the shifter with this transmission. I got it to slide down. Now it's just a matter of will it actually shift how it's supposed to. All right, now that we have the shifter section on, hopefully it actually can shift. Make sure you put your shifter in, make sure it'll go into every gear. If it doesn't, you'll have to take this off and then resituate that. Maybe your shifter fork isn't lining up with the forks in the gear set. I can't actually test that unless I would maybe say pull the one out of my Miata. That's kind of a hassle to do that because my hydraulic handbrake is all bolted in the same location. So it would be taking off basically the whole center console area to get the shifter out. Now, this isn't hard to just break this back section off and redo that at a later time. Just for ease of video production, we're gonna bolt this together. I was able to get it to go 3rd and 4th gear, which is fine. As long as you can get it to shift something, it's probably gonna be correct. However, like I said, worst case scenario, if you have to take just the shifter section off later, it's not that difficult. So we're gonna take your bolts. It does not need Loctite or anything on these bolts. However, I'm gonna throw a little bit on just in case. For my drifting application, there's lots of shock and vibration to the transmission. So I'm gonna make sure that these don't come loose. You don't want that. If it were to come loose, it could potentially spill transmission fluid all over the track, and that's not good. You don't want that. And we'll just drop these in. Now you do want to make sure that each one of these bolts start by hand so that you don't cross thread them when you throw an impact or something on them. Just a small impact is fine. You don't need to tighten these down super crazy. Tighten them down with the impact quick and then hit them with a regular ratchet just to make sure they're nice and snug. Do this kind of in a star pattern so it doesn't squish all of your silicone out of one side, and you're just gonna do a light snug. If you snug it down too much, all of the silicone is just gonna push out. Now that they're all kind of snug, we're gonna leave this sit for just a couple minutes so that silicone can kind of dry and cure a little bit more. Then we'll go through and star pattern these bolts on again, but with a ratchet, just to make sure they're nice and tight. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to snap these bolts or crack the casing, because this is just cast material. If you tighten that down too much or you white knuckle it, you're gonna wreck the threads. So now a couple minutes later, let's get these tightened down in kind of a star pattern. Get it to where it's kind of snug. Go like a quarter turn past that. I'm sure there's probably a torque spec somewhere. I couldn't find it. So this worked just fine for me. My other transmission that's currently in the car is not leaking at all. Now we switched over to the inside of the bell housing. We're going to get this large snap ring back into the bearing, and then once that's on, we can get that front cover put on here. This should be all clean. I cleaned that before I even started doing anything with the gear set. So we'll get this snap ring on here and then get that front cover on. I also put silicone on the front cover already, so we should be all set to go in just a minute once I get this snap ring back in place. I have to start off with one side here and work it around. It's awkward because you're reaching down into a bell housing. Just like that. I actually was able to put that in without using the snap ring tool. Just slid it around the bearing. And that's nice and tight, doesn't go anywhere. Transmission turns and everything. Should be all set that way. Now let's get that front cover on. When you put the front cover on, make sure you put a little bit of Loctite on your bolts that hold that front cover around those bearings. I'm sure there's probably a gasket somewhere for these. I just run the high temp silicone all the way around that mounting surface. It hasn't leaked on the other one. Should be all set and ready to go for this one. Now before you put this on, make sure you got this shim, this really small spacer in there. That creates that slip surface between this plate and the bearing, the main big bearing back there. If you don't put that in there, you could potentially over tighten this plate onto that bearing and have a failure point right there. So this should be all set and ready to go. I put a little bit of oil on this seal as well, so that can go over this and seal properly. Just like that. Just press it on. Then we're going to get these bolts in place. Make sure they start by hand before you put some sort of an impact on them. And there it is. That transmission is rebuilt. It's ready to go. Got a fresh, free spare ready for the Miata. If you have any questions about rebuilding your Miata transmission, feel free to drop a comment down below. I will answer your question the best I can. That's all we have for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.